Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with, well, it's not really an old tank repair video. It's not really a straight up restoration. It's just, well, an old model polish up video, I guess is the best way to put it, for my 1/6 scale radio controlled Armortek M4A4 Sherman tank. This model here is actually an older build. It's hard, wow, it's imagined to say it's an older build. This model was actually a subject matter of an entire video series back about 10 years ago. And again, it's still just amazing to think it's been that much time since I built this one. But regardless, this model here I built on the YouTube channel, and you can see it from start to finish in the video series. Well, after I finished the model, of course, I've driven it a bunch, just on my own time. And a number of years ago, I went ahead and just parked it in the shop that I have here. The model has been parked in this location now basically ever since, and honestly it has been stored improperly, leaving it to the condition that we have here. Currently the model is dead, the batteries have been completely discharged, and the surface is covered in a layer of dust and dirt, as well as a bunch of other yucky stuff. Some of the details have also been broken off over time, some of which have been when the model has been driving around. Others have been from just bumping into it, because these things are in the shop, they're on the floor, and they are somewhat in a snag-prone location. So after always looking at this thing in the corner of the shop here, I decided, you know what? I think it's time for me to show this thing some love, get it back to the condition that we saw it originally when I first built the model, and also, most importantly, I now have a location to store it, and store it properly. The model is going to be moved to my other location, where I have a number of my other 1/6 scale models that have already been showcased on this channel, and this one here is going to be added in that location where it can be prominently put on proper display. Outside of what I just mentioned, I do have the Armortek M4A3 Sherman tank kit en route, and I want to give the shop a bit of a cleaning in preparation for this new kit that is coming in. Part of doing that is to make some space on the floor that I have over here, and move some of these models that really are in a storage position, which is not exactly the best. Another reason why I want to give this model a well-deserved polish job is because, well, this one here is one of my favorite builds. In fact, this one here is a gem in my collection because it's really a moon rock. As far as I know, and as far as I've been able to determine, as of the date of filming this video, this is the only 1/6 scale radio-controlled American configuration M4A4 Sherman tank. If I can rewind a little bit on this model's background, this model here was released back in 2011 by Armortek. When Armortek announced this kit, they released it as a British converted 5C Firefly with the 17-pounder gun and the Firefly pattern turret with that square loader's hatch. When I purchased this model, I had the idea of, rather than building it as a Firefly, to build it back to its American configuration, being the M4A4, because it's just a oddity in the Sherman family tree. When I saw that the kit was announced, I went ahead and contacted Armortek, and I told them what my intentions were. What they went ahead and did was they hooked me up by swapping out the Firefly turret, which would have been originally supplied with the kit, with the original low bustle turret that was supplied on their first release M4A3 Sherman tanks, which came out in 2005. The model was shipped in this configuration, and then I went ahead and built it up to the configuration that we see here with all the details and modifications that have been made to this build. Of course, all of that information I'm not going to be going into in this video because, well, that's discussed in extreme depth in the M4A4 build series, which of course is found on the ECA channel and can be found on the playlist listed in the video description below. To add to the exclusivity factor of this model over here, keep in mind that the Firefly kit was also a very limited release kit when Armortek produced them back in 2011. There are only 25 of the Firefly kits that have ever been produced, and of those 25, this one over here is the only 75mm equipped M4A4 Sherman. And there's a quick shameless plug on that note. In the years that followed this build over here, I actually was contacted by a customer who had a Armortek 5C Firefly kit. He sent the model here, and I went ahead and built it and completed it in the British configuration, complete with the 17-pounder gun. That model is another playlist that is found on the ECA channel, and again can be found in the video description listed below. Now that you're all up to date on the background of this model over here, let me just go ahead and touch upon what I'm going to be doing in this video. In this video, I'm going to be getting this model fully restored back to the way we saw it originally when the model was first built all those years ago. To do that, the model surfaces are going to be completely washed, get rid of all that disgusting dust that's on the surface. All of the details that are currently broken on this model are going to be repaired, and repaired to a seamless manner. But more importantly, I'm going to be doing some modifications under the hood. You see, this model here, when it was built in my usual configuration of the era, where it actually had 2 lead-acid batteries that were the model's power source. Well, in the years that came after the construction, I swapped them out for lithium-ion batteries. In fact, this was the first model that I did the lithium-ion swap to. At the time, it was a complete success and set the path forward for the builds that came afterwards. Since this model over here, all of my Armortek builds utilize the lithium-ion power source. Well, in the years that followed after this build, I've actually went ahead and learned more about the lithium-ion batteries, specifically how to charge them, as well as also how to store them. When this model here was built, I had no way to kill the batteries, so that when the model is set aside for a long duration of time, the batteries don't discharge. And unfortunately, that is something that this vehicle does have. Like I touched upon before, this model currently is dead as a doornail, so I'm going to have to trickle charge it in order to get enough juice to power it up, to get it onto the ramp over here, or I should say the lift table, in order for me to actually do the polish procedure. Outside of the battery kill switch feature, I'm going to be revising the recharge system as well. This vehicle had a simple type of recharge system where you plug 2 little jacks in and you hit a little switch. That system's a bit overcomplicated, and it doesn't fully charge both of the batteries, because at the time I was told that you could charge the batteries in series. However, this really wasn't the case with lead acid, let alone with lithium ion. So this model here is going to be receiving a battery recharge upgrade, much along the exact same lines as what was discussed on the King Tiger build that I had a video about this topic posted a little while ago. So with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and dig into this one. First thing I'm going to do, I'm going to glove up, because I think a mouse may have lived in this thing for a little while because I left the hatch open. So hopefully I don't find a mummy on the inside, because if I do, I'm probably going to be really, really grossed out by that. So I'm going to go ahead and glove up, pop the turret off, hope for the best, and, well, let's see what happens. Well, before digging in, let's go ahead and go up close with the camera. You can see the surface is just layered with this disgusting dust here. This is basically garage dust. As you can see, it just flakes away pretty easily, and I'm going to be touching upon exactly how to remove that momentarily. You can see some of the damage. A brush guard here popped off. These are one of my older metal brush guards, so straightening it out and remounting it shouldn't be too much of an issue. More of that dust. Here goes the other brush guard. Looks like it got smashed at some point. And here we have the rear dimpy little mud flaps. This was something that or I should say was broken during the course of operation. These pieces here are really, really frail and fragile, and this is actually on par with the real Sherman, which is why these were pitched really early on in the war. However, for this one here, I really wanted to have them, so I'm probably just going to go ahead and repair them, repaint them, and hope for the best. Moving along, see the surface has some scratches here or there. By the way, this is what happens when you run your model excessively. You know, the more you use it, more damage like this is just going to be inevitable. You can see the sprocket here, some of the paint's chipped off on the teeth, or I should say on the fasteners. Other than that, the model's in pretty good shape. The front tin work over there got bent up right over there, so that's going to need to be addressed. Remainder details are pretty good. It's actually not in that bad a shape. It's just more or less dirty. The real work on this is going to be the electronics when I open up the model. The M2HB, mostly intact. This is a T&E mount. It's not really relevant for this model over here. Don't know where it came from, but I'll take care of that as the model goes through its paces. So let me open up the hatch. There's the main power. Like I said, the battery is completely dead. So in order to get to the battery, the turret is going to need to be removed because the batteries are directly below the turret that we have right here. Here you can see the back, smoke system, there's the control panel. This is going to be altered quite a bit when the new system gets mounted in place. Okay, well, let's go ahead and get the turret off. First thing I'm going to do, I'm going to close the bow hatch. I'm going to take off any of the loose details that I have over here. I'm going to put them on the lift table, which is directly in front of the model. And, well, here we go. Lifting the turret. So I'm going to put my barrel, or my hand under the barrel, and lift up. Looks like I disconnected the turret at some point, so that's actually beneficial. Nothing dangling on the bottom. Alright, so with the turret off, you can see the inside of my model now. Well, let me go ahead and bring the camera in closer so I can get to the batteries, which need to have their recharge commencing. Well, here's the condition of the inside of the model, and sadly, it's not in good shape. As you can see, there's a bunch of mouse shit on the inside. Yeah, a lot of little bits of mouse rice. And yep, we got some mouse piss. That's lovely. Okay. Well, so far so good in the fact that there's no dead one on the inside here. If that was the case, yeah, I would not be happy right now. But this is going to require an extensive cleanup job because this shit here is not good for your health. So, where to begin? Well, where to begin is I got to get the batteries charged, and then I could go ahead and get the thing on the lift where I could start emptying everything out, giving it a cleanup, and trying to do as much disinfecting as possible. So, the job just became a little bit harder, but hopefully not something that is too hard to do. Yeesh. Alright, well, no point keeping on talking. Let me go ahead, get a screwdriver, and hook up some leads to these batteries. With the batteries out of the model, I could go ahead and hook them up to a charger in order to get the voltage back up. Once the voltage is back up, I could patch it back into the wire harness. At that point, the model will be mobile again, and I could get it up onto the clean lift table that we have right here. What I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to go through the painstaking job of inspecting the wires to make sure that Mickey didn't go ahead and use any of them as a chew toy. And hopefully, with any luck, he spared me from that type of a repair job. Well, fast forward to the next morning, I went ahead and gave both of the batteries a charge in order to rejuvenate them. One of the batteries I was able to put the bolts back in, and that one seems to be working perfectly fine. The other battery, however, is doing some really strange things. The charger, when it's hooked up, it does recognize that there's a battery there, and it has it charging, but it just stays at 25% no matter how long I keep the thing plugged in. Afterwards, it does a really strange thing. When I remove the terminals and wait about 10 or 15 minutes or so, and when I connect it to a battery tester, the thing reads that it's fully charged and it goes off the charts. I hook up a little electric motor to it and it also works. What's bizarre to point out is that when I immediately take the charger off and I try the battery leads, it only goes to 25%. So, unfortunately, this is above my pay grade. I have no idea why that's the case. If anyone out there is an electrician or an engineer and can, knows the actual answer for that, please let me know in the comment section listed below on why that's the case here. For the tank, I already purchased a replacement battery. That should be coming in a day or two. It's going to be a fresh lithium ion, so it should just drop right in and be done with it. This one here, of course, I'm going to hang on to it. I'm lukewarm if I'm going to keep it in this build or not. Probably not. I'm probably going to swap it out with the new one just to cover all bases. But the other one I might do some tests on. It's a little weird. Anyway, so I hooked the batteries up in series, patched them into the main power, turn on the tank, and the tank does turn back on. I do have full power. The radio is actually pretty charged. So from here, I can limp the tank back onto the lift. At the moment, the lift does not have the modification for the anti-tilt, so I am going to have to put some blocks of wood down in order to prevent the table from tilting on me when the tank's weight transfers over to the table, when I drive it on with ramps. Okay, so the model is now back on the lift. The lift has been elevated to waist height, which makes it much easier to work on. And the very first thing I'm going to do is begin the disinfecting process. This I'm going to hit with a two-prong approach. The first is with a vacuum. I'm going to go ahead and vacuum up all of the particulate, namely the little pellets that are on the inside. Once that has been cleaned out, the next thing, and probably the most important thing, is to address the dried up urine stains. Mouse pee is nothing to sneeze at. It's actually quite dangerous. So when it comes time to actually getting in there and manhandling stuff with the disinfectant, I'm actually going to be not only wearing gloves, but wearing a respirator because I really don't want to mess around with it. Whoa, hold it right there. This is post-production John talking, and one thing that I really didn't touch upon was that you're really not supposed to use a vacuum to pick up mouse droppings. The problem is the mouse droppings can become airborne due to the exhaust from the vacuum, and you will then contaminate the air in the environment, and that's where the health risks really come in. Unfortunately for this build here, I really didn't have any other choice, and the vacuum had to have been used in order to thoroughly disinfect the inside. However, I did utilize the proper safety precautions when utilizing the vacuum. First, I wore a very good mask. My respirator was the one that I used for resin, and it's actually also rated for the type of mouse droppings that the thing was going to be cleaning up. The second was that the vacuum was actually kept outdoors during the procedure so that any type of particulate that was going to be thrown back into the atmosphere was going outdoors as opposed to inside of my shop setting. The last thing I want to touch upon is that the vacuum itself after the job was completely and utterly disinfected. I'm talking about the entire thing was taken down to its smallest component and everything was disinfected with all sorts of chemicals, from household cleaners to denatured alcohol, you name it. I went ahead and thoroughly disinfected it. The filter was discarded and then a fresh one was put in place. Once everything was fully dried up, the unit was reassembled and the vacuum is good to go. I also, by the way, went ahead and tested it with a black light to make sure there's nothing there, and good news is the thing was thoroughly cleaned out. So I just wanted to add this little bit of extra commentary in because I'm pretty sure some people out there are going to be watching this and they're going to be yelling at the screen, you're not supposed to use a vacuum to clean up mouse stuff. So you're absolutely correct, but again, the situation demanded it. Anyway, let's continue back with the video. For the actual disinfectant itself, I gave it some thought. I think I'm going to go with denatured alcohol. That should be more than enough to disinfect any of the surfaces that are on the inside. And the alcohol will actually not affect, hopefully not affect any of the electronics. Obviously the model's off and it's not connected to any power source, but I don't want to go with a water-based solution in order to do the disinfecting. What's going to make matters a little tricky, though, are with all the wires that are on the inside. It's kind of spaghetti in here, so trying to get in there and disinfect everything is going to be a bit of a challenge, but it's something that is still doable. But we're going to be going over that aspect when I get to it. For now, I'm just going to start it with the easy step, which is to be vacuuming up all those stupid little pellets. The interior is all vacuumed, and it's vacuumed pretty much as this machine can do it. One modification that I made was actually a pretty clever one. I might keep this mod on, this vacuum, for other, similar tasks. Now, mouse poop specifically, but, like filings and things along those lines. What I did was, because of the tight confines, I wasn't really able to have a whole lot of luck with the standard adapter here on the vacuum. So what I simply did was I took this length here of tubing and I taped it to the end, giving me a restricted inlet, but this one is much more flexible and I was able to get into those really tight confines where the clutter was remaining. There may be one or two areas that I missed. I'm probably going to give it a second and a tertiary run with the vacuum, but basically the inside is cleaning up pretty well at this point. Most of the little rice nuggets are gone, and from here I can probably progress further with the denatured alcohol wash on many of the surfaces. There's one area in particular though that is giving me a hard time. Right here on the floorboards there's a clear piece of Lexan, and it's not in a structural important area, but the problem is right underneath it is a pile of the little peanuts. So what I'm going to do is the only way to tackle is I'm probably going to have to drill a hole or cut that section out with a Dremel, and then I'll be able to get in there with the vacuum and pick up that little cluster. It's really the only feasible way. Other than that, the inside looks pretty good at this point, all things considered. And I'm also going to be, move the camera, removing this little section over here for both getting access in there with the vacuum, but also a lot of the functions and features over here are going to be changed and modified. So the way the piece is in this current configuration, it's not going to last in the long run. To swab out the inside, I basically made this giant Q-tip that we have here. It's nothing more than a square stick with a bit of paper towel wrapped on the end and it's held in place with some masking tape. Not sure how long this will work or if it'll work at all, but you know, will be a learning experience. So the alcohol is doing a really good job with getting the areas nice and clean. In fact, I haven't seen them this clean really since I even built the model, so that's really good. Some of the areas obviously going to be hard to get into, and with the stick it's a bit rigid, so trying to flex in there obviously is going to be a bit problematic. So I had the idea where I found one of these little extendo grabber things in the shop. Let me go ahead and soak a rag on the end with denatured alcohol, because this might be able to get into those areas and scrub them a little bit better. One advantage, because the thing is a literal grabber, I don't have to secure any tape around it or anything, so let's see how this pans out as well. At this point here, really the two concerns that I have is, one, yanking on wires on the inside. This could lead to issues. And the second is while spilling any of the alcohol on the surface of the model. Obviously this will hurt the finish of the build. So I've been mostly being extremely careful, and so far I've been pretty lucky with the process thus far. One area I noticed where the concentration of a lot of the filth is right here in the front, in the motor section. So let me go ahead and get in there, and so far this tool is actually doing a pretty good job of that. Well, let me get on with it then, I guess. With the camera off the tripod, you can see what the interior looks like now that it has been fully disinfected. All the little bits of mouse crap have been removed, and the surfaces on basically everything you see here has been thoroughly polished down with both denatured alcohol as well as also a few squirts here and there of Lysol for good measure. On the floorboard over here, you can see the section of plastic that I removed in order to get to that dried up pea puddle that I touched upon earlier. Well, with that little section amputated, I was able to get in there with the appropriate cleansers. So, with the side job now out of the way, it's now time to get back to the original intent that I had for this build, which is now to upgrade the electronics. On the back panel here, you can see that I went ahead and removed the recharge switch, as well as those two little ports for the recharge jack inputs. The hole is going to be kept, as well as the entire panel here, because, well, this is actually a really convenient location to put the new recharge jacks once I go ahead and craft them. With the camera brought back into the other shop, which by the way is much cooler compared to the other environment, I could go ahead and start with the next leg of the restoration, which would be to modernize the model's electronics. The only thing that needs to be addressed, like I touched upon before, was modifying the batteries to have a kill switch. That is what we have right here in this unassuming cardboard box. You see, with the way the model was built previously, the batteries were just hooked up in series and were connected all the time. And if you go with this system, you're going to be having some problems, specifically as the model ages, because the batteries will eventually discharge on you. Even though the model is off and the main power switch is not turned on, the batteries still have some current flowing through them, and after a while they will drain to the point where the batteries are no longer holding any charge. And this is something that is extremely frustrating, as well as also extremely expensive, because you always have to buy new batteries every so often. Well, for the model here, I'm going to be changing that by retrofitting it with the kill switch. If anyone have ever watched some of my more recent builds, you'll see this bit of equipment discussed in more depth. The unit itself, of course, was purchased off of Amazon.com. The link is listed below, and these units are very effective and are also highly recommended. There we have the unit. It's a very simple thing to hook up. You solder together some leads with some eyelets on them, torque them down with the nuts that we have here, hook it up to the batteries, and you're good to go. Red means it's off, green means it's on. Simple as that. And here's the battery harness now all wired up, and it's ready for mounting inside of the model. And by the way, on the battery front, I actually have some really good news. Like I stated before, one of the batteries just wasn't charging. Well, you know, I had nothing left to lose, so I decided to just plug the damn thing in and just walk away for the entire day and go about my usual daily activities. Well, after a day or two of just leaving the thing plugged in, I come back and the battery was fully charged, or so the battery charger says so. And I even tested with the charger, or I should say with the tester here, and that seems to be the case. It's going to be interesting to see exactly how much of a charge it does hold, but for the time being, it seems like, well, the batteries were just fully discharged. There is a internal discharge circuit board on here that I guess prevents any sort of long-term damage on that. So hopefully, knock on wood, it's working, and I don't need to replace the batteries again. So that seems to be you know, a plus note. Yeah, that actually turned out not to be the case. I went ahead and took the system after filming this, dropped it into the tank. It drove about 5 feet, and then it just crapped right out. So what I went ahead and did was I replaced the one battery that was in question. The one battery seems to be working perfectly fine. It's holding a charge just fine. It holds up under load, and it's working as advertised. The other one, however, it's just I don't know what's wrong with it. So I simply replaced it with that one that I bought from Amazon that I touched upon earlier. That battery, so far, knock on wood again, see how good that did me last time, that one actually is doing pretty well, and you know, it's working as advertised. So for the time being, it's going to roll with that one, but of course, if there's any changes or anything, I'll be sure to let you guys know. On the wiring harness here, it might look like a tangled mess of an octopus of wires, but rest assured, it's actually all, you know, thoughtfully laid out. Starting with this cord over here, you'll notice that there are two jacks on this, and this is so I can charge the batteries independently. Like I stated on the one King Tiger update that I just posted, when you have two batteries like this hooked up in series to bump up the voltage to 24 volts, you cannot just have a single point of recharging. It's just not going to work. It may look like it works when you hook it up to the charger, but what you're actually doing is you're getting a false reading. You're really only charging one of the batteries, and the other one, it's not getting a full charge. So the battery charger is notifying, hey, yo, the thing's fully charged. Actuality, it's not the case. You might not even notice it. The model will still work, it'll still run just fine, but you are going to have shorter run times because of that, and you are actually possibly causing damage to the battery that is getting starved out. So in order to charge batteries, if you are using a dual battery setup, regardless of the model, you need to have them charged independently, and that's what we have over here. One unit charges one battery, and the second one charges the other. Pretty simple. Unlike the model when it was first built, where I had that neat little switch system where you hit the switch and the thing starts charging, that just adds extra complexity that's really not necessary. So it was abandoned, and the plug layout was also changed. On my older builds, I had this like microphone type plug system that was used for the charging. Well, those systems are a bit haphazard. They work fine at first, but the problem is after prolonged use, they are a bit frail. So rather than going with that, I use my contemporary system here, which is basically what Armortek actually uses, and it's these thick 2-pin nylon connectors. These things are very robust, and they work extremely well. This is the one thing that has not changed on the Armortek tanks as far as I've seen from day one, so bear that in mind. It's funny how things go full circle. In fact, one of these cords here is one of the recharge jacks that come with the Armortek tank, so take that for what you will. The other one here, I went ahead and just fabbed it up. I have these jacks on hand, and I also have the thick gauge wire along with the eyelets, and I was able to fabricate everything. So these two here are what charge the batteries. This lead here is what, well, obviously plugs into the tank's power outlet. And then that takes us to the voltage cutoff box. The unit here is actually the bridge wire, and it's what connects the two batteries, giving you the 24 volt. Why this is important is, well, you want to separate it from this point here, because when you you hit that switch, you now isolated the batteries. You now have 12 volts a piece, and this will then allow you to charge the batteries independently. If this thing is on, you have 24 volts, and you're not exactly charging the batteries fully, like I stated earlier. In addition to all of that, I went ahead and added a simple bit of equipment to this battery setup here that was actually missing when I first built this model. And if you saw the batteries being hooked up or removed, you'll probably know what I'm talking about, and that are the little rubber protective sections here on top of the terminals. When I first built this model, I didn't utilize these pieces, and you know, I just built them with the terminals exposed. This is something that's really less than ideal. You can actually have accidents occur where things touch the contacts, bridging them and causing some short circuits. It has happened before, and it's one that really sucks when it does. So on builds that came after this one that we have here, I went ahead and started applying these little sections. They just drop right into place, and they're really affordable. These ones here I picked up off of Amazon. The link is listed below in the video description. So now that everything is fully wired up, I'm going to go ahead and test it. As you can see, the power box is off, so right now the batteries are at 12 volts apiece. To test this, I have here the lead that goes to the tank, and I'm going to hook it up to the tester. If the wiring is not properly set up, the voltmeter, or I should say the battery tester here, should have a reaction, indicating that there is juice flowing through. And with the prongs plugged in, you'll see that that's not the case. The second I hit this switch, though, try that again. It just goes directly off the charts. So it's working. Go ahead and kill the power. All right, now to test the batteries separately, I'm going to try this one over here, and I'm going to hook up the red one to the one on the opposite side. If the units are still connected and there's still juice flowing between the two, even though I'm connecting the jacks to separate, the terminals to separate jacks, the voltmeter should have some kind of a reaction. So let's see if this works. And as you can see, that's not the case. Let me go ahead and test it on this one terminal. And you can see it works. Same thing with the other. Okay, so as you can see, all of the wiring is appropriately connected, and at this point here I can go ahead and take this entire jumbled mess and secure it back into its home, which was on the inside of my Armortek M4A4. So here we have the batteries now remounted on the inside of the vehicle. They just dropped and slipped directly into place. Luckily, with the way I designed the model, the batteries are really easily accessible via the turret hole that we have here. To the back portion here, you can see how the new layout is configured, which is really not configured much at all. Originally intended to have the recharge jack wires run between the speakers and emerge from that hole. In execution, trying to get everything stuffed in one shot was a bit problematic, so I said screw it, I'm just going to have the wires just right here on the top. They're easily accessible and shouldn't be any problem. For the cutoff box, similar story. On my other builds, I usually fasten it in place with some kind of adhesive or fasteners, or one flavor or another. For this one here, I'm just going to leave it loose. Again, it makes it easily accessible. I can just grab it, actuate it, stuff it back in, and I'll be good to go. Keep in mind, this is, of course, a conversion, and a quick one at that. If I wanted to build this model from the ground up, of course, I would have a better, more permanent solution for this type of a system here. But for this one, it's more than suffice. I know some engineering types, or possibly some Germans out there, cringing at that notion to having wires just slightly loose on the inside here, but that's how we're going to roll on this one. Like I stated earlier, one of the missions for this build was to go ahead and get the surface completely cleaned off, making it as good as it was, or as close to as good as it was when the model was first completed all those years ago. To do that, all of this layer of fine dust needs to be removed. And some people might be wondering, well, that's easy to do. Just take it outside, blast it with the hose, and you'll be good to go. Well, there's a bit of a caveat to that. First, this is a radio-controlled model, of course, and the last thing you want on the inside here making contact with any of these electronics is water, specifically a large volume of water, which is what you will get if you try to use a hose, because water will undoubtedly enter into the vehicle through the various ingresses, like the hatches, and on this one here specifically, there's that engine grill found on the rear portion of the engine deck. Also, using water does have some other issues to it. Because there's a lot of dust on the surface over here, if you just try to throw water onto it, what's going to happen is the dust is all going to wash off, but it's going to wash off and accumulate in certain trap areas. If this happens, the dust is going to become this pasty, almost like a weathering wash type of a system, and it's actually going to cause other problems. And you're not really going to be able to remove it outside of anything of just straight up repainting it. So you don't want to do that. The other issue that water can lead to it is a situation called sunspots. If you ever wash something that's really dirty and you let it sit out in the sun, the water is going to accumulate into small little droplets all over the surface. And when it dries, you're going to have little rings of just random shapes all over your surface, and this is due to some of the particulate that I mentioned before, just puddling up and then just setting and leaving for a nice little spot. Or you have a other issue with, which is like what I have, is specifically if your water is hard. If you have hard water, you're going to get those minerals to just leave spots on the surface when the water dries. Neither of which is something that's ideal. So you might be wondering, well, John, what are you going to do to wash the model? Well, on the upper extremities over here, the best way to get the dust off, and it's probably one of the most simplistic and non-evasive ways to do it, is with a brush. Here I have a soft bristle brush, or what is mostly a soft bristle brush. It's a cheap one, it's like from a dollar store or whatever. But this is going to be used to basically just brush away the dust, much along the lines you see with archaeologists when they dig up dinosaur bones. This is a great way to just physically move the thick, poofy areas like you see here off of the surface, but it doesn't harm the paint, and it also doesn't lead to the dust accumulating into those crevices, causing those other issues that I touched upon. Once those big poofy layers of dust are removed, you can possibly hit it with a hose, but you have to stay by with a chamois of some sort just to soak up any of the puddles that remaining, or the little droplets that remaining, to avoid those sunspots that I mentioned before. To start this process, it's as simple as, well, sweeping it off. Hopefully with the camera light here you can see just the layer of dust that is just getting swept off of the surface towards the back. By the way, this is also a way to mitigate dust growing on the surface of your models if you keep them in a room-type setting. A lot of times you will have a large-scale model like this, and one of the bigger problems that you'll have is that because of the larger size, keeping them in a dust-free environment becomes a hassle. Unlike something, say, in 1/35 scale, where you can put in one of those really cool plastic self-sealing boxes, something 1/6 scale, it's obviously not necessarily going to be that easy. So generally just put them on a shelf, and off it stays in your room or display area for all to see. Well, over time, dust will obviously grow on the surface, and if it does, you're going to encounter a similar situation. You can use compressed air when the dust is really, really new on the surface. It does work to mitigate it, but if you need to actually physically get in there and remove it, the brush is a great way to do so. And because you're not using any chemicals, of course, it's safe to use indoors. If you really have a bad case of OCD, another way to check to see if you brushed an area clean or not is by using a blackout like this one here. If I show it on the surface, hopefully it comes out in this lighting that we have, but you will see some fragmentation or some particulate on the surface. Well, here you can see that with the brush it gets rid of almost all of that unwanted material, leaving for a clean surface. Also, of course, if the turret is off of the model, it does make it easier to dedust. If the turret is on the model, what you want to do is you want to start the dedusting process from the roof of the turret and then work your way down to the hull and then finally to the outer extremities. By doing this, this will prevent you having to re-sweep areas that you already covered previously. Because obviously, when you sweep it off the turret, it's going to accumulate on the bottom portions and so on and so forth. Once the turret is fully dedusted, it's then time to remount it to the vehicle. To do this, I just have to go ahead and plug all of the various connectors in place, which are required before the turret can pop directly back where it needs to be. One thing I do want to touch upon involves the main Sub Loom. The unit just plugs together in a really easy format. However, and this is true specifically on their older units, but even on some of their newer ones too. With the way the plugs are designed, once you clamp them together, they lock in place in a really strong and firm manner, which is great. The problem is that it's a little too tight. And what I mean by that is that if you ever need to take the turret off of the model like I needed here, trying to force the plugs apart can sometimes be a tough battle. In some cases, you could possibly even cause damage to the wires or to the power boxes that the wires are connected to because of all the friction and force required just to yank the two pieces separate. On my builds, what I'd like to do is I'd like to meet the pieces basically in the middle where I connect the connectors enough where the metal connecting points are plugged together, but the nylon piece isn't fully seated in place. This is so you'll see that it's held on with friction, it holds on in a nice strong manner. All of the electrical connections are at the moment where they need to be, but if I ever need to get access or pop the turret off again, I can simply unplug it. This is one of those simple little tricks that you don't really think about unless you have to service one of these models. Okay, so the turret is now back in its proper place. The Sherman, luckily, is one of the lighter turreted vehicles that are made by Armortek. The Tiger 1, it's a little bit more of a handful, but probably the one that is the worst in this regard is obviously the King Tiger. And you know what? I wouldn't be this surprised if the Centurion is up there too. Those things, the turrets weigh as much as probably a whole static model, I mean a 1/6 scale model in their own right. But for the Sherman, specifically the one here with the 75mm turret, that's just not the case, fortunately. Carrying on brings us to the portion of the restoration now where we go ahead and repair the superficial surface details that were damaged and I touched upon earlier. Starting with the brush guard that we have here, the taillight brush guard must have been smushed at some point. It must have clearly had an impact of one sort or another. Fortunately, the brush guard is still in place. That's good, I didn't lose it or anything. Same thing goes with the other one. It was just misshapen. This is one advantage that these sheet metal brush guards do have over some of their plastic counterparts, because if they get smushed, you could easily, or relatively easily, torque them and bend them back into shape. In worst case scenario, the solder joint snaps, or possibly the paint chips off of the area if bent too severely. But fortunately for this one here, neither of those are the case. The brush guard off camera was bent back to its appropriate geometry, and at this point now I'm just going to super glue it back to its surface. I will be doing some touch-ups later on towards the very tail end of the restoration, but for now, let's go ahead and get all of the busted components back in their appropriate locations. A little bit is really all that's needed. Once the CA fully set, this brush guard here is going to be good to go, and I can progress with the one on the opposite side. One on the opposite side suffered a little bit more damage compared to this one here, where not only did the brush guard pop off, but the taillight itself cracked off at the base. Fortunately, all the components are there, and it didn't chip into sub-assemblies, which would make the repair a little bit more difficult. Fortunately, this brush guard here wasn't really mutilated. It just popped off of the sculpted well beads that I did when I first built the model. This is actually great because, since it's just a clean break, these pieces just drop directly back into its appropriate location. Surprisingly, another bit of detailing that popped off during the restoration process was the MP48. MP48 is still in perfect condition. It just simply popped off at its glue joint that connected it to the turret. Just a little drop of glue is all required to get the unit back into place, which I've already done just now. Just a little, and we're good to go. While on the MP48, I do want to take this opportunity to point out that on the ECA catalog, there are a few different options available for the MP48 spring antenna base. You have the standard MP48 like we have here, the soft skin variant, which has the external insulators found on the top and the bottom, but then there's a third option, and it's kind of one that's a residual item that I've been thinking about replacing and retiring off of the catalog. That one's known as the RC antenna, and what that does is it conceals the aerial that needs to exit from the vehicle as this nice bit of detailing that we have here. This bit of equipment was a really popular item a number of years ago, but in recent years fell out of popularity, but lately has been taken up again, and it's been picking up again for dubious reasons. You see, that MP48 set is fantastic if you have an old school antenna. What I mean by that is like an antenna like, say, this one over here, where you have to pull up on the wire. These versions needed this bit of detailing because they use a different frequency. On those ones, you have a really long little white wire that's connected to the RX, and that one needs to be exiting of the vehicle in order to get the radio reception from the controller. And concealed in a nice little bit of detailing is a great way to camouflage it. Well, with the advent of 2.4 gigahertz radios, like, say, this one over here, which, by the way, this is the radio for this model, you don't need that bit of equipment anymore because the RXs use a different frequency, and they have these two little stubby antennas found on the RX. With those systems, the need to run the wire up is no longer necessary. So the older antenna, like I stated before, it's a bit of an old piece, and it's mostly just kept on there in case anyone has one of the older radios and they want to upgrade it with a nice bit of detailing. However, a lot of individuals out there don't know this about the 2.4 gigahertz, so lately I've been getting a lot of orders for the RC one, specifically with the new Armortek Sherman that has been released. And it's a dubious item, and whenever I see one on my order form, I always contact the customer, letting them know, are you using a 2.4 gigahertz? Because if you are, this piece isn't necessary. And it costs more than the standard static antenna base. So, just as a public awareness, if you're building any 1/6 scale American tank and you have an MP48, if you have the 2.4 gigahertz radio, you don't need the ECA $30 extended antenna base. Just go with the standard edition static one, like this one here, and you'll have the detailing that you need without the need to patch it into the RC. And by the way, with the $30 one, if you try to connect it to the 2.4 gigahertz by extending the antenna, you're going to ruin the RX. So don't do that. Just putting that out there, because lately, like I stated, I've been getting a lot of orders for that piece, and individuals just don't understand that they don't need it if they're going with a modern radio. The next thing to repair is the front fender work. Both of the fenders during the course of operation have suffered a little bit of just wear and tear. These are in a really snag-proof, or I should say a snag-prone location due to their location. You can easily bump into it, but more importantly, they are directly over the track, and whatever the dirt and debris gets kicked up by the tracks, it's going to somehow make its way to the front fenders. Well, on this one here, it was torqued upward in a pretty severe manner. Unfortunately, I didn't get the way it looked like before I started with the repair process, but if you look back in the video in the beginning, you'll see it's kind of jutted up in the air. In order to fix this, specifically without having to take off the metalwork, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start rebending it back into place. Because both of the tin work on this model are just made from sheet metal, this does lend itself for this type of a procedure. The sheet metal, for those who have never done any sheet metal work before, basically sheet metal has some springiness to it. There is some spring type tendencies to the metal, and if it bends up into a certain way, you need to retorque it and basically give it new memory in its home state. To do this, this is going to be done, of course, by bending it in certain key locations, And unfortunately, I can't really point out what those are. These really change depending on the type of bend that's going on. But basically, it's all done by feel. The way I'm going to do this, I'm going to wedge the screwdriver under the fender here in certain key areas. When I find the area that I think might be the issue, I wedge up on it, and then I push down on the front portion that we have here. This is giving it a lever, or I should say it's giving it leverage so that the force is being applied down, bends it in a certain key spot, giving the metal some new memory. And after a while, once you've done it enough times, the fender is going to be back in its home position that we see here. Obviously, after about a few bends here or there, I already have the unit 3/4 of the way back to its home spot. Well, let's just see if I could go ahead and get this fender all the way to home plate. And that's all there is to it. On this one here, it's not as bad as the one on the opposite side. It is bent up slightly in a few areas, but basically you can see it has a nice little ding in this area over here. The ding is fairly easily remedied by just, again, hand torquing it in a few certain areas. After a little bend and tweak or two, the curvature has been returned. Now to go ahead and take care of the other bend, basically going to do the exact same steps. Only this one here you have to be a little bit more careful because I have this cast resin early war siren here, and this is a piece from Panzerwerk who's sadly no longer in operation, but that makes this piece here just a little bit more special. And that's it. This guy here is now fully repaired. Moving our way rearward takes us to the largest repair that needs to be made to this model, and that's on the rear mud flaps. These mud flaps here are a necessary evil found on this pattern of vehicle. They are so susceptible to damage, but again, they're just one of the hallmarks found on this really early pattern of Sherman design. The design itself is basically just a carryover from the M3 Lee, not so much with the way they're shaped, but really with the concept of having this type of a rear mud flap found on the back of the vehicle. These pieces here were extremely frail on the real tanks as they are on my model here, and it wouldn't be uncommon for these to get damaged or just straight up cut away in field. Later Sherman designs, this would be revised to a different pattern, but that's more or less a topic for another video. The one on the opposite side is in better shape. The leading edge is just bent in a few locations, but this one here really did take the brunt of the damage. This one, not only is the angle all out of shape, but the leading edge is bent and all wobbly in certain locations. But most importantly, the biggest problem is that it's missing the side panel, which would have been originally soldered to this area over here. The one on the opposite side, I am going to go ahead and straighten it out, but this one here is going to require the brunt of the work. A few people are probably going to be saying or writing in the comment section, John, you should leave it. It's weathered. It looks good. It looks, nice all banged up and stuff. That's not really how I like my builds. I want to keep it symmetrical with the opposite side. If it didn't have if the piece was still here, I could have just straightened it out and basically, would have left it as is. But since it's missing the piece entirely, it needs a complete repair. So to do that, I'm actually going to first straighten the leading edge, then I'm going to retorque the angle, and then I could fabricate a new side section and then solder it on. The side portion is probably going to require the most amount of work because I have to pre-paint, or I should say pre-prime it, and then solder it to its location, which will then allow me to then do the paint work. So it's almost like doing auto body repair in some respects. So the first thing, like I said, is to straighten out the leading edge, and to do this I'm going to use a dead blow hammer, and I'm going to be using a PVC tube to act as a form. The PVC tube is just going to be wedged underneath the metal fender, and then I can just tap away, which will then straighten out the edge. Unfortunately, I don't believe this PVC tube is going to be good enough. Yeah, you know what, it'll work. Scratch that. So now that I have the piece wedged in, I could go ahead and straighten it out. And there we go. The dead blow hammer made real short work of refining that leading edge. Okay, so with that out of the way, now I'm just going to go ahead and retorque it so that it's at the appropriate curvature. And this is basically just done by eye. Many of the techniques that I'm employing right now to do this are the same techniques that I employed on the front fenders in order to get them back to their natural tension point. To fabricate the missing piece, I'm going to need to go ahead and use a template. I went ahead and dug through my template stash to see if I could find the templates that I used to originally craft these pieces. Fortunately, they look like they have been misplaced over the years. So I'm going to go ahead and trace a new template from the example that we have here. To that, I'm just going to take some cardboard. I'm going to line it up and just go ahead and trace away. And there we have our template. Just going to do a quick little refinement. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead, cut this out, transfer it to metal, and then I'll be able to go ahead and go through the procedures to go ahead and resolder it to the opposite side. And here's what the piece looks like now that it's been transferred over into sheet metal. You'll notice that for this model here, I'm going to be using a slightly different technique compared to the other sheet metal work that I've showcased on this channel in the past. On those builds, both of these components would have been left in the white, and then I just go ahead and solder it together, and then carry on with the priming, painting, and installation. Well, for this one, I'm going to have to do a slightly different technique because obviously the piece is installed to the model and it's fully painted and weathered. Someone is probably wondering about that. Well, John, can you go ahead and just remove the tin work and work on it that way? Well, the answer is no. You see, it is held in place by 3 fasteners, but trying to get the fasteners on in the first place was hard enough, and trying to remove them is just really not worth it. So I'm going to have to utilize a slightly different technique. For this one here, you'll notice that the panel has been primed on both sides, and at this point it's actually ready for the installation. Of course, I'm going to have to be using solder for this. Obviously, adhesives are not going to cut it, and I'm going to be utilizing a technique that's very similar to what's done in, well, auto body as well as even just general welding. If anyone has ever welded components before, this technique should look fairly similar. The first thing I'm going to need to do is remove the layer of paint found on the leading edge where the solder bead is going to go on both the panel as well as also on the tin work here. This is absolutely required because the solder is not going to be able to bond or adhere to the metal if it's covered in a coat of paint. And this is true obviously for both pieces. To do this, I'm going to take a Dremel with a cutting stone on here, and I'm just going to grind off just a small bit amount of material on the locations where the soldering is going to occur. Of course, this has got to be done to both sections. Okay, with the grinding work out of the way, this should give me a perfect location to add the solder. The solder, of course, well, I should say the grinding is useful for both removing the layer of paint like I just touched upon, but it's also really handy because the abrased surface here acts as a really good surface for the solder to adhere to, and it gives you a really strong bond. For the soldering itself, I'm using my standard equipment, which is my soldering iron. Plug that in, wait for that to heat up, and then I could also show the soldering flux as well as the spool of solder itself. Or I should say the solder and the iron itself were procured from Amazon.com, and the links are listed below. The flux I just purchased from the plumbing department from either Home Depot or Lowe's or Ace. It doesn't matter. All hardware stores all carry pretty much a product which will work for this application. After a minute or two, the iron heats up very, very quickly, and I am ready to do the procedure. So if anyone have seen my other soldering tutorial videos, this should look extremely familiar. I'm just going to take a little bit of flux, smear it onto the appropriate locations, basically where I abrased it with the Dremel. And this is done to both the tin work as well as on the little end plate itself. once I have the flux on, I am ready for the soldering. So I'm basically going to tack it onto the location, much along the same way you would do to a piece of steel if this was a larger vehicle. So like right there. Let that sit, let the solder solidify. And then I need to tack it on the rear portion over here just to fight that bend. So okay, with the piece tacked in place, I could adjust the shape a little bit. All right, and now I could continue with the remainder of the bead. Probably the hardest part is holding the piece securely, specifically waiting for the solder to cool down. The metal gets pretty hot pretty quickly, so it is going to lead for a little bit of discomfort, specifically since I am doing it barehanded. You can't use a plier, of course, but just sometimes you just have better luck or better, experiences just holding it in place with your hand and waiting for it to cool down. Obviously, if it's getting too hot, drop it. You don't want to burn yourself, but it gets right to that point where it gets close to a burn. Again, just mostly discomfort. That's why you do it in sections, because it both makes for a stronger bead, and also it gives your hand a little bit of a reprieve from holding hot metal. And there we have it. Okay, so the piece is now fully repaired, and well, it's now ready for its lower hull wash, and then I could get the thing repainted, or I should say touched up. Obviously, I'm not going to be repainting the model, I'm just going to be giving it some touch-ups here or there. Before I can even do that, though, I am going to go ahead and wipe down the area that I just soldered together. There is flux, or liquid flux, on the surface. That's going to cool off and become that paste like we saw before. And this needs to go just to prevent any sort of problems with the adherence of the paint. To remove it, this is a oil-based type flux, so turpentine is generally used. But for this one here, I'm probably not going to use that because of the primer that's on the piece. I'm probably going to use either denatured alcohol or some other type of substance to see if I could go ahead and clean the surfaces off, but we'll see how that pans out. Okay, well, the denatured alcohol looks like it did the trick, and the primer is still pretty much there, in the same condition as it was before. So, before I can paint it, I need to go ahead and get this model off of the lift, driven to a certain location where I can hit the lower extremities with the hose, and we'll see why in a moment. With the model back outdoors, I could go ahead and wash the model's suspension, and when I mean suspension, I'm talking about the sponsons and downward. Using the brush is not going to be as effective as the outer extremities because of the different type of dirt. On the outer surfaces, it was just garage dust, while on the lower sections, it's road dirt. Road dirt is a little bit harder to get off with a brush type setup, and it's best done with the hose. Also, because the model was sitting for as long as it has, there are some sections on the lower extremities that do have some cobwebs and probably a bit of spider webs or two, and these need to be just washed off, and the hose makes pretty short work of it. Another thing that, or I should say it's another benefit of watching the sponsons down, is that the ingress of water onto the interior is not going to be an issue because, again, it's pretty much sealed up in those locations. The last thing, and the last benefit that the hose is going to have, is to clean off the tracks. The tracks, as you can see, are a bit dirty from all the running that I've done with this thing over the years, and a good wash couldn't hurt. So, with that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and grab the hose and start the rinse down. On the areas where there's a bit of an overspray, a quick wipe down with a towel or a chamois is a good way to avoid the sunspots that I was referencing earlier in the video. Of course, with all that out of the way, the last thing left to do is to paint the various locations on this model. Obviously, a big one here is this red section on the tin work, but you can see there's some other chipped up areas that can be improved with just a little bit of paint. For the application, I'm using my airbrush, and you'll notice I maxed up these areas over here. There's going to be more mask being added just to prevent any sort of overspray. This technique is pretty much similar to what you see on many auto body repair videos that are found on YouTube. On the paintwork, and specifically on blending it in, this is one thing that you need to factor in if you're working on a radio control tank, be it in 1/16 or 1/6 scale, or anywhere else in between. You want to keep the paints, I don't want to say simplistic, but something that you can easily flare in the case of a touch-up situation. There's a lot of really cool weathering techniques out there, such as washes and filters and things along those lines, and they look phenomenal. However, you have to be aware that if the tank is radio controlled, it is going to get scratched. It's just the nature of the beast. These things get used, you will get wear and tear. Wear and tear is literally a thing. And if you have a painting style that is really, really complicated, trying to make everything flare in is going to be very problematic. It's actually going to stick out like a sore thumb. On this one here, this is actually a very simple paint job. It's really two colors. We have the main base coat, and then we have a darker shade of olive drab airbrushed on for modulation, and that's it. On my larger scale models, I don't even varnish them for the same reasons that I just mentioned. If you try to varnish it and touch it up, you're going to have a location, even if you revarnish over that spot, it is going to stick out and it's not going to look very good. If you keep it simple, the repairs can easily blend in and the model can look better for a longer period of time. And without further ado, this project is hereby officially completed. This restoration took a little bit longer and required a little bit more effort compared to what I was originally anticipating. However, obviously it was totally worth it. Getting the model fully patched up and outside and actually running again, it's a feeling that is most definitely appreciated. You know what though, before we go any further and wrap up this video, let's go ahead and take a quick walk around this model. Briefly going over some of the repairs, here you can see the front fenders. Note how they are at their appropriate locations and are not kinked or bent up. That procedure that I mentioned and touched upon earlier really did a fantastic job getting them realigned to their appropriate locations. Same is also true for the rear tin work, and as you can see now that everything has been painted and weathered in, it just blends in seamlessly with the remainder of the vehicle. However, obviously, if I try to take this thing off-road, I guarantee you these are going to be the first things to get damaged due to any sort of twigs or other bits of foreign particulate that can be drug up by the tracks and basically wedged into this portion over here. The other things that were heavily damaged but repaired were the rear taillights as well as the taillight brush guards. You can see how, again, how perfect the brush guard looks now that it has been repositioned as well as reblended into the remainder of the paintwork. One other thing I want to touch upon are the dome-headed rivets that I mentioned earlier. Some of these popped off over the years from the models running. The pieces themselves are just resin dome head castings that I mount on the rim area to improve the detailing of the model. The pieces are just held on with simple super glue and are not held on by any other means. Some people out there might be watching this and feeling that that is a insufficient way to mount these details on because of the locations they might be prone to damage. However, that's not necessarily the case. These rivet details here are actually very, very resilient and hold up quite well. With the way the VVSS Sherman wheel is designed, there's not really a whole lot of stuff that can get in here to knock the resin details off. Of course, I did lose 2 or 3 of them over the course of a decade or so of driving this thing, but considering how many of these little rivet heads are found on these wheels, that's actually a pretty good ratio. The replacements, I use the exact same molds that were used to cast the original pieces. I just simply casted them. I painted them off of the vehicle along with adding their weathering, and then when it came time for the installation, I added a little drop of glue where it needed to go, and the details were then added. One other thing I want to point out, you can see this model here is beginning to show its age in some areas. Note the rubber tires are definitely something that looks like it has been rolled on very, very often. There are nicks and tears and little chips knocked out of them in certain locations, which again just helps to the overall look of the build. Another thing that adds a little bit more juice to the gravy is right over here on the volute springs. You can see that there's a little bit of surface rust on some of the locations. This is all natural weathering, and it's something that I'm not going to mess with. Well, that's really it in terms of anything noteworthy to mention. Nothing left to do than to go ahead and get this one driven to its new location. So let's go ahead and fire it up and get them over there. Well, after a little bit of fiddling and adjusting here and there, I think I found a perfect setup in order to have the model displayed in this area over here, but have it easily accessible, so if/when I want to take it out for a spin, I have a very easy path to do it in. And if you're wondering exactly where is this new area that this model is being displayed and stored in, well, this area here is none other than my display room. One recurring question that I've been frequently get asked since I started posting videos on YouTube is, John, can you make a collection video? And this is something I was never really able to do because it is really problematic to try to get my models all in one area in order to film a video on them. With the amount of tanks that I have and with the scales that I have models basically stretched and stored everywhere, okay? So I have 1/6 scale tanks over here, 135s over there, 116s in another area, and it's just too scattered about for me to actually do a focused collection video on. Within the last year or so, however, I've actually been working on a way so that I can have a good chunk of my collection in one area, and in one area that's actually very presentable. And that's this location that we have here. This, of course, is a very small selection of the models that I've already built and posted on this channel. These ones here, I built about a year or so ago. All of the ones built previously to these builds here, those are at another location, and I'm not going to bring them over because, well, they're on display in another location. However, all of the builds that have been being built and showcased so far are going to be located and stacked up in this location here until I basically run out of room. Moving further, you can see several of my other 1/16 scale radio controlled vehicles. Of course, this is only a small fraction of the other models that I've built and are shown in the collection, but again, they are currently here on display. This, I believe, is a short-term thing because I'm going to be needing the floor area for 1/6 scale tanks as they get built and as they get fixed up, so this is definitely going to be something that's subject to change. And of course, directly behind the 1/16s, we have some of my 1/6 scale builds, which going left to right is my late production M10 tank destroyer, followed by my M3 Lee, and all the way on the right hand side, my 1/6 scale T26 E3 Pershing. Of course, if anyone's a fan of the channel, you'll know that this is not the entirety of my 1/6 scale collection. In fact, far from it. This is only a small fraction of the 1/6 scale vehicles that I've built and completed over the years, both static and RC. All those models are still stored away, and eventually the goal is to go ahead and take them out of storage, clean them up, make some small minor repairs here or there to them, and then get them stored in the display room that I have here. Of course, this is something that's not going to happen overnight, but is something that I'm going to be doing gradually as time goes on. This room here is definitely not going to be able to store all of them, so I'm going to have to figure out exactly how to display them in this room and also try to find other areas in this location where I could go ahead and keep these models on display. But more information on that, of course, is to follow as time goes on. It's also really good to have a display setup like this because I can actually really appreciate my builds. Considering the amount of work and effort I put into building every one of these, when the models are built and they get stuffed away into storage somewhere, you kind of forget about them, and that leads to many of the issues that led to the circumstances in this video. Well, with this type of a setting here, that's just not the case. You could just admire them, look at them, drive them from time to time, and it's just, again, it's just a better setting compared to the way they were previously. And probably the very last thing, it is really refreshing to wake up in the morning to be greeted by your own little miniature version of Bovington waiting for you to start your day. One last thing I want to touch upon before I sign off on this already overloaded video is in regards to the model's batteries. It doesn't matter what type of battery type you use. If you're using any sort of 12-volt battery, being lead acid, AGM, gel cell, lithium ion, regardless of all of that, they will all do the same thing if you do not have them plugged in to a trickle charger all the time. If the batteries are just left to sit, either if they're hooked into series like the way I had on this model here for the longest time, but even with the shutoff switch, eventually the batteries will discharge on you. Because of this, you have to have them hooked up to a trickle charger basically all the time. If anyone has a collection of cars or knows someone who has a collection of cars, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. For instance, if you see those Jay Leno videos, every one of his cars has a trickle charger plugged into it and the wires are going under the hood. If you don't do that, trust me, you run the risk of having to frequently change out your batteries. With lead acids, the things will sulfide on you, and even with lithium ions, once they discharge to a certain point, they never really fully recharge to their original condition if they get to that point. And with that, that wraps up this restoration video for this 1/6 scale Armortek radio-controlled M4A4 Sherman tank. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel where it's a great way to keep updated on new posted content, being restoration videos like this one here, or my usual content consisting of small scale model showcase videos and 1/6 scale project update videos. Another way to keep in loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There I have more photographs of not only this build, since I built it all those years ago, but all the other smaller and larger scale builds that are showcased on this channel. Finally, don't forget to swing by EastCoastArmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detailed components. Till next time, catch you later.